Hi everyone, Dr. Hall here, and we're going to move into our third and final lecture on the digestive system, taking an approach, this time looking at it from the nutrition side of things. And in this first part of the lecture, we're going to talk specifically about macronutrients, macro meaning large, right? Nutrients as in substances that we need to consume and eat and bring into our body in order to be healthy. So as we talk about types of nutrients, we have three main categories. We have the macronutrients, which are the things that you might be thinking about when you think about a diet or what you eat and the things you want to be sure to get enough of. So we've got our three large organic molecules: carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids and fats. Nucleic acids are, of course, the fourth category of organic molecules, but they're not all that important. We can easily manufacture them out of other things. And then we also have, in addition to the macronutrients, we have vitamins and minerals, which we'll talk about in the second half of this lecture. So let's focus in on macronutrients, and we'll take the carbohydrates first. So carbohydrates are molecules that are made of one or more sugar molecules attached together. So the subunit for carbohydrates are sugar molecules or saccharides. If you've ever heard the word saccharin applied as an adjective, it means very sweet. So saccharides are sugars. So glucose, for example, is a monosaccharide because it is a molecule that is made out of just one saccharide. There are disaccharides, which are also small sugars, but it's two saccharide subunits linked together. Lactose and sucrose, which is table sugar, are examples of disaccharides. And then if we hook a whole bunch of saccharide molecules together, that's called a polysaccharide or a complex carbohydrate. So our simple carbohydrates have just one or two saccharide molecules in them, and then our complex carbohydrates have multiple. There are polysaccharides. So what are our dietary sources of carbohydrates? So sometimes we eat simple carbohydrates, right? Mono and disaccharides, so sugars, glucose, fructose, which is the naturally occurring sugar found in fruits, hence the name, sucrose, which is table sugar, lactose, the sugar found in milk and dairy products, and many others. So of course these are found in juices and sweets. They're also found in fruits and dairy, and they are in the American diet added to a lot of our other foods to make them taste better. Now, these are great sources of energy, but because they're already broken down into their tiny subunits, they get absorbed very quickly from the intestine into the bloodstream, and so can cause a really huge increase in blood glucose levels. They can happen right away. The liver sometimes can't keep up in terms of converting it all the extra to glycogen. And so there's some evidence that having those huge increases in blood glucose levels from ingesting large amounts of simple sugars, simple carbohydrates, might encourage your body to store more energy as fat, and also might encourage your body to have trouble with regulation of blood glucose in the future via insulin. So it might increase your risk for diabetes later on. So for that reason, we recommend that these simple sugars, these mono and disaccharides, are limited in your diet and as much as possible should be eaten in their natural form. For example, if you eat a strawberry, that's actually much better for you than just taking the fructose that is normally in that strawberry. So if you eat it as a whole food, it slows down the absorption. It's much better for you. And there are other substances in that food besides the sugar that are good for you. So what about complex carbohydrates? So complex carbohydrates give us a nice slow release of energy, slow release of glucose into the bloodstream because they have to be broken down. They have to be mechanically and then chemically digested from their polysaccharides into their mono and disaccharides in order to be absorbed. So they tend to be much healthier for us. And we have two main categories of foods that give us our complex carbohydrates are grains. So specifically, things like whole grain often not only have this great energy source for us, but also contain fiber, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then grains also often contain beneficial nutrients such as proteins, which we'll talk about later, as well as vitamins. So vitamin B1, which is thiamine, is usually found in a lot of whole grain foods, and that's an important nutrient for us. Vegetables and fruits as a source of complex carbohydrates, they tend to be very high in fiber, which is non-digestible complex carbohydrates or polysaccharides, but they also tend to be very high in vitamins and oftentimes in minerals as well. Overall, most vegetables and some fruits are not very energy dense. There aren't a lot of absorbable calories in them for us, but because of their vitamin content and their fiber content, they are still very healthful and beneficial. So I mentioned fiber a couple of times already. Let's talk about what exactly that is. So when we say fiber, what we're talking about is complex carbohydrates, polysaccharides, that we are not able to digest because our bodies do not produce the enzymes that are capable of chemically breaking them down into their smaller monosaccharides so that we can absorb those. So these are things that we cannot digest and break down. And they're divided into two main categories, insoluble fiber and soluble fiber. So insoluble fiber doesn't dissolve in water, hence the name insoluble. It doesn't dissolve, it can't be a solution. So what it does is it adds bulk to the stool, which gives the intestine something to push on to help move things through. Cellulose is an example of an insoluble fiber. And these are found in things like whole wheat, bran, nuts, green veggies, and seeds. And so, when you eat a stalk of celery, a lot of that just goes right through and out the other end, right? We don't absorb a lot of that because we can't digest it. So it mostly just kind of passes through, adds bulk to the stool. So it's still good for us, right? Even though we're not necessarily absorbing a lot of what is in that celery. And then on the other hand, we have soluble fiber, so named because it does dissolve in water. And the nice thing about soluble fiber is that it's osmotically active, so it's going to hold on to water, which is useful in preventing constipation. So oftentimes if I see a patient who's having trouble with constipation, we'll talk about maybe eating some oatmeal every day for breakfast, or increasing their consumption of fruits and other foods that are high in soluble fiber. So that can be really helpful. The other thing that happens with soluble fiber is that it's osmotically active, holds onto water, and kind of forms a gel-like substance. So if you've ever made yourself a bowl of oatmeal and you didn't finish it, or there was a little bit stuck left, and then you lose track of it for an hour or two, and then you might notice that it gets to be this gooey gel-like stuff. And so that's what soluble fiber does. And what's interesting about that is that gel tends to bind cholesterol and other potentially harmful substances in our diet so that they either aren't absorbed at all by the body or absorbed not quite as much or more slowly. So you have perhaps seen on a bottle of Quaker Oats, right? They have this little thing that says oatmeal helps reduce cholesterol, and that's actually true. So eating a bowl of oatmeal a day can help decrease people's overall cholesterol levels because you will absorb less lipid and cholesterol from the diet. Some examples of soluble fibers are pectin, inulin, and beta-glucan, so if you've ever seen those mentioned. And so food sources would be fruits, oats, nuts, and legumes. Legumes are like peas and beans, right? So that's why beans are really good for you. All right, so that was carbohydrates. We talked about simple and complex, right? Those monosaccharides and then those disaccharides versus the polysaccharides, some of which we absorb and use for energy sources. Carbohydrates are some of our main energy sources, and some parts of carbohydrates we don't digest and absorb, and that would be the fiber. So let's move into talking about proteins. So proteins are made of amino acids, are their subunit, that are strung together into peptides, which are then strung together into polypeptides, and then ultimately into proteins. So every protein that we eat, we're going to break it down, we're going to digest it with our pepsin from the stomach, our trypsin and other enzymes from the pancreas, brush border enzymes as well. We're going to break those proteins all the way down into their amino acid subunits. So then we're going to use those amino acids to build our own proteins, right? So we're going to build muscle fibers like actin and myosin, keratin, for that keratinized stratified squamous epithelium on our skin. Collagen is a protein in that dense irregular connective tissue. Enzymes are proteins. Albumin, of course, which we know and love, is a protein. Fibrinogen, globulins, all of these things. So proteins in our bodies serve as structural components as well as enzymes. They're super duper important. And it's kind of interesting to think about the fact that I may eat something that has keratin or collagen in it, but then my digestive system is going to break it down into its constituent amino acids so that I can absorb it, and then my body will rebuild the keratin or the collagen or whatever it needs, right? So just because I eat collagen or take a collagen supplement doesn't necessarily mean now that I'm going to have more collagen in my body, right? Because we break it down and then we assemble whatever we need. So there are 22 standard amino acids, of which 9 of them are considered essential. So when we talk about nutritional things, when we talk about something being essential, that means that our body cannot make it. We don't have the enzymes. We cannot chemically produce that particular molecule. We cannot make that amino acid, so we have to eat it and absorb it and get it into our bodies that way. So I've listed them here. I'm not going to ask you to remember those, but so we have to eat these specific 9 amino acids. If none of the amino acids were essential, we wouldn't have to eat protein at all. We would just build our own amino acids, right? But 9 of them are essential. We have to eat them. So this is the entire reason why we need to eat protein at all. It's also why a lot of times people talk about the incredible edible egg. So eggs are one of the foods that are known for having really high levels of those essential amino acids. So of course you may remember that scene from Rocky where he eats all those raw eggs. So just a word to the wise, you don't need to eat them raw. You can go ahead and cook them up as an omelet. You're still going to get the same amino acids. There's not really a benefit to eating them raw, except maybe it just makes good cinema. All right, so protein in the diet. We need to eat protein because we need those 9 essential amino acids. What are our dietary sources? Well, so we have a lot of different animal sources because animals, ourselves included, right? So a lot of our structural components of our cells are made out of protein. So if you're eating parts of an animal, you are getting lots of proteins. So in general, animal foods, right, meats, dairy, eggs tend to be very high in protein. They also tend to have a lot of the essential amino acids. And so if proteins have all of the essential amino acids, they are called complete proteins. So of course they have all of those because those are the same ones that we need to do the same types of things in our cells and our bodies. They may also, however, contain a lot of saturated fats, which may promote atherosclerosis, which you remember as those plaque buildup in the arteries, hardening of the arteries, which can cause narrowings and lead to things like heart attack and stroke. So when we compare meat versus non-meat animal sources, so still all animal sources, meats also tend to be really high in iron, which is a really important mineral for us that we'll talk about in the second half of this lecture. So muscles have a molecule in them called myoglobin, which is very similar to hemoglobin, so it's very high in iron. Milk, cheese, and yogurt any dairy product tends to be really high in calcium naturally, right? Especially if it's milk, right? This is a substance that the mammal is producing for its baby, which is growing and developing and calcifying its skeleton. So we have evolved to produce milk that is high in calcium because our infants need a lot of that mineral. Eggs are also really high in iron. So all of these sources will give you complete proteins, and then meat and eggs will also give you a lot of iron, whereas the dairy products will give you a lot of calcium as well. We can also get a lot of our protein from vegetables, and a lot of people get their proteins exclusively from vegetables, right? People who are vegetarian. So legume family. So legume crops are crops that are able to pull up nitrogen from the soil and use it to create molecules. You need nitrogen to make amino acids. So this is a unique quality of certain plants and not other types of plants. So the legume families, so beans and peas are really good at pulling up nitrogen. It's called nitrogen fixing, happens through a combination of their roots and certain bacteria that live on their roots, and they're able to incorporate that and build proteins. So those kinds of plants, beans and peas, are high in protein. Seeds and nuts, right? Soy protein, right, comes from soybeans. So tofu, soy milk, those things also tend to be quite high in protein. Mushrooms also are high in protein, which is pretty cool. And whole grains, so whole wheat, brown rice, are high in protein. Now, one thing about non-animal sources of protein is that usually there's no one food that will provide all of the essential amino acids. So that means most of the proteins that you find in plant sources are not complete proteins. So you need to make sure you eat a variety of these different foods in order to get all of the amino acids you need. One exception to that is spirulina, which is a type of blue-green algae that is a complete protein, and that's one of the reasons that a lot of health food stores will recommend people take it or use it. It's not any kind of it doesn't have any superpowers, right? They'll call it a superfood because it's a complete protein, but a steak is a complete protein too. So it's not unique, it's just if you want a non-animal source of a complete protein, there you go. So now we're going to move into talking about lipids, which is fats and oils. So first of all, I think it's really important to acknowledge that lipids have gotten a bad rap. And they've been portrayed as things that are really unhealthy and bad for us. Now, it's true that most Americans tend to eat more lipid than is healthy, and it can create problems for them. However, we need to eat fats and oils. These are actually an essential component of our diet. So first of all, you need to eat lipid in order to absorb the lipid-soluble vitamins, vitamins A, D, E, and K. You cannot absorb them well if you are not absorbing the fatty acids that they hitchhike along with through that whole process with the micelles and the chylomicrons and into the lacteal. So you need to eat fats in order to absorb those fat-soluble vitamins. Most people need some lipid in the diet in order to meet their energy needs. So lipids, when you look at their molecules, they actually pack a ton of energy into them. That's part of their utility and why they're so interesting. And so it can be really difficult to get enough calories to meet your daily needs if you don't eat any lipids, if you don't eat any fats and oils. So really tough. We also need them to keep the gallbladder healthy. So remember when we talked about gallstones, which can occur if bile just sits around in the gallbladder for a prolonged period of time. And so we find both in people who are really ill and hospitalized for a period of time and not eating anything for a long time, or in people who don't need any fat in their diet at all, the bile just sits in their gallbladder and they develop this stasis, and their gallbladder can get inflamed and they can form stones. But you want your gallbladder to contract on a regular basis and empty itself of bile to keep things moving and keep things healthy. And in order to make the gallbladder contract, you need to eat some fat. So they're important for the gallbladder. But most importantly, just like there are essential amino acids, there are also essential fatty acids. These are fatty acid molecules that we need. They are necessary for life, and our body does not have the ability to create or manufacture them. So we must eat them. There are two: alpha-linoleic acid, or ALA, which happens to be an omega-3 fatty acid, and then linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fatty acid. So if you've heard people talk about how healthy fats are found in things like salmon and walnuts and olive oil and kale, that's what they're talking about, these essential fatty acids, particularly the omega-3s. So when we look at dietary sources of lipids, right? So animal sources, right? So the dairy products, especially those that we refine to focus on the fat content, like butter, whole milk, cheese, lard, meats, fish, seafood, right? They tend to be very high overall in a type of fatty acid called saturated fatty acids, or saturated fats, which, as we mentioned before, might increase your risk for atherosclerosis. In general, if something is solid at room temperature, if it's a lipid, it's usually a saturated fatty acid. So butter is saturated fat. Whereas if it's liquid at room temperature, it's usually an unsaturated fatty acid. So that's what we find in a lot of the plant sources of lipids. So a lot of our cooking oils, right? Olive oil, canola oil, corn oil, avocado, nuts, seeds, olives, all of these things tend to be high in unsaturated fats, which are considered healthier. Now, what about those essential fatty acids? So that's where these, quote, superfoods come in. They just tend to have a lot of, especially that omega-3 alpha-linolenic acid. So walnuts, almonds, flaxseed, salmon, eggs, especially if the chickens were pasture-raised chickens that were out eating grass and bugs, as opposed to ones that are given feed. Olive oil, avocados, dark leafy green vegetables like kale, spirulina, right, which we talked about before, nori, which is the seaweed that's used for sushi rolls, and interestingly, pasture-raised meats. So there's a lot of interesting research showing that if the animal is eating out in the pasture, kind of the foods that it was kind of evolved to eat rather than being fed grain in a barn, then their meat has a lot more of these essential fatty acids and more omega-3s and fewer of the unhealthy fats. So in terms of the contribution of animal sources of lipid to atherosclerosis, there's some conjecture now that it might be more due to what we're feeding the animals that results in those fats being unhealthy for us, rather than just them being an animal source in general. So, in summary, for the macronutrients, end of this first half of this lecture, we need to eat these macronutrients. So our carbohydrates are our major energy source. They're going to provide our calories, which is just a unit of energy. It's how we measure the energy in food. They're also going to give us fiber, right, which could be soluble or insoluble, and is present for keeping us regular, as well as also pulling some toxins out of the body. There are also sometimes, like our whole grains, are going to provide vitamin B1, which is thiamine as well. We'll talk about that later. So proteins, we need to eat them because we need these essential amino acids, and proteins can be used as an energy source, right? Those amino acids can be turned into glucose by the liver in that process called gluconeogenesis, but it's very inefficient, and in general we'd like to keep amino acids around for building proteins and not use them for making energy. Lipids, we need to eat them to get our essential fatty acids, and they're an excellent energy source. So we'll pick up with part B of this lecture, talking about vitamins, minerals, and then our overall diet.